DuMont back in Chicago. Thanks very much. We continue on this week's edition of Beyond the Beltway, and we've been talking about impeachment. We're going to be talking about other political matters as this hour unfolds. But again, we would be remiss if we did not spend a moment talking about the big story in America today, and that is the tragic death by helicopter crash of Kobe Bryant, the legendary star of the Los Angeles Lakers. And this is one of those stories that it dominates the news. It's going to continue to, I think, dominate the news for the next couple of days because there will be a funeral. But again, it's a shocking story to hear, even though I don't think anybody at this table ever met Kobe Bryant. I don't know whether there's any really dyed-in-the-wool basketball fans here. But again, Judith, when we came in today, you wanted to make a comment about it because it is a dominating story, and it is a shocking story when someone dies tragically and quickly.
It's a very shocking story. I mean, here's a young man. He's 41 years old. He's a basketball coach for his child, who's 13. He's taking her to a practice, and this terrible tragedy happens. I mean, this is beyond, if he weren't famous, none of us would know about this, right? But he is famous, and so we all know about it. But it's a terrible tragedy when you think of it in the human terms. And it just brings you up short in your own life. I mean, everything is so temporary. Everything, we just don't see this all the time. And when something like this happens, it really makes you focus on how fragile everything is.
It's a reminder also, I think, that the last conversation you ever have with someone that you love or people that you love should always be positive and uplifting.
That's right.
So, any other thoughts on this, other than we're all sort of, it's a collective mourning that someone has died tragically, but...
Yeah, I would say we've become a really fragmented society, and in sports and athletics is a place where we come together and we kind of put aside our differences in politics. So a figure like Kobe, who looms so large in our culture, won't be forgotten. And I'm a professor. I know my students were very passionate about Kobe Bryant, and they're mourning him certainly today.
Okay. Let's move on. Let's go to George, listening to us in Austin, Texas on KLBJ. Go ahead, George. Nice to have you with us.
Okay. Thank you, Bruce, and fellow commentators. You asked a question earlier about allowing witnesses.
Yes.
On this impeachment. I'm adamantly against allowing witnesses, and I can tell you why I believe that to be so. Is that when Adam Schiff and Nadler were conducting those investigations on the House side, they were very dishonest and unfair in their investigations, and they disallowed the Republicans in many ways to come back and refute some of their claims, and they even wouldn't allow them to have witnesses. So I believe that they structured this thing, and it was like a frame-up job, and they played hardball on the House side. Well, how about the Republican senators play hardball on the Senate side? That's what I'm thinking.
Bruno.
I have to agree with them. I mean, I was going to make that comment. It's if they had something in the Constitution where you kind of like had a conference of the House and the Senate, and they got together and decided on processes in advance or something like that, and that's not written in the Constitution, and that's okay that it isn't. But this impeachment was a luck of the draw situation. You ended up with a Democratic House that was going to do what they were going to do no matter what, and they had made that decision. And then you have the Republican Senate that's going to do what they're going to do. And both houses are empowered to do things the way they want to, and they are empowered to suffer the consequences of the way that they do them.
And it's what the Founding Fathers wanted.
That's exactly what they wanted.
In a way, I'm sympathetic to the idea that if the House didn't call witnesses, then the Senate is under no obligation to, even though I think from the perspective of wanting to get the kind of full width and breadth of the truth, I think it would be good if they did. But can take at least a moment to acknowledge what the caller is saying and what Bruno is saying, that statesmanship is dead, that there is only the concept of what is politically and partisanly advantageous to do. No real understanding of, even if it is not necessarily in my political side's interest to do this, maybe it is in the interest of the truth and the nation to do it. None of that seems to exist anymore, and we live in a more hyper-polarized and partisan society at a time where the political parties have never been weaker, and we seem to be in some kind of a spiral because of it, and I think it's sad.
We also live in a world where the media defines what's a profile in courage. And it seems to me that all the pressure now is on Republicans to demonstrate a profile in courage. One of these Republican senators to stand up and basically turn against or be for witnesses, which conceivably could be viewed as turning against the president. But again, nobody talks about a profile in courage on the Democratic side. Is there anybody on the Democratic side that's going to stand up?
To
well,
their credit, and not Judah says too. There was the woman who, I think she was a black Democratic representative in Michigan somewhere, and she said, impeachment isn't right here. We should just censure the president for what he did.
Yes,
and
but not in the Senate yet.
Well, no, it wasn't in the Senate yet, and within 20 minutes, she's forced to recant by the Pelosi Inquisition.
Right.
What, on what grounds does some leader force somebody to recant a situation like that?
This is just the flip side of what I was saying earlier about, like, you can't as a defender of Trump say it wasn't a perfect phone call. You can't say that it's not prudentially wise to proceed with impeachment. This is the world we're in now.
Marcussello.
But the framers anticipated this, and they debated this. They wanted the House to have the power to make the accusation, the Senate the right to try it. And Hamilton said, it ought not to be forgotten that the demon of faction will, at certain seasons, extend his scepter over all numerous bodies of men.
Right.
And we're in that moment.
Yes,
this is
we
the
are.
season. And so what they did, the safety net they built in, and it's going to play out precisely how they envisioned, which is they said the best we can do is require a 2/3 majority. And because that would suggest that it is the will of the people,
That's
that
right.
there is something to it. Other than that, it might be a partisan thing, and we have to accept that.
So they'd be happy.
So I think they'd be very happy
We
with how
discussed
this is
this
playing
last
out.
week on
No,
this
I
program.
think-
Everybody agreed last week.
I think they would be happy with what's
And
going
the
on.
voters will decide in November.
And the voters should decide in November. That is exactly. I mean, to impeach the president with what now 11 months left in his term or remove him is crazy. If the people of this country think there's something wrong with Donald Trump, then they should go to the polls and they should get rid of him. And that's how the country is supposed to work. Unfortunately, in the world we're living in now, with the tweets and Twitter and Facebook and everything else, nobody wants to live that way. Everybody wants their position to be the one that is ascendant. Everybody else has to stop. And I want to talk about this censure idea that you brought up for a second. I mean, if anybody had any sense, and I really do believe that the Republicans don't have any sense and the Democrats don't have any sense. But if anybody had any sense, whether you think Donald Trump was right or not, whether you think the call was perfect or not, somebody would say, you know what? Let's just censure him, okay? I bet you would get a majority in the Senate that would go with censure, and you'd pick up some Republicans. You are never going to get Republicans in the Senate to throw him out of office. But they would censure him because a lot of them don't like him.
I don't know about that.
I
Oh, no,
think
you'd
I agree.
get
with
it.
you. I'm not so sure that it would get to 35 as the former Senator Jay Fleck has said that if everything was a secret ballot,
No,
Trump
no,
would
no,
lose
but I
35
think-
votes. We've got to pause.
Okay.
1-800-723-8029. More calls when we come back from Chicago.
A new exhibit from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Bruce DuMont back. We're going to switch gears and talk about some other issues right now. First of all, a week from tomorrow is when everyone will gather in the great state of Iowa for their big caucus. And, of course, that's the big issue of what is likely to happen next. And, again, some recent polls came out. In fact, let's take a look at those. These are the Democratic matchups. These are New York Times. You will see that in Iowa, we have Iowa and New Hampshire. In Iowa, Bernie Sanders, actually the order in both states is the same. Bernie Sanders in first place, then Pete Buttigieg, then Joe Biden, then Elizabeth Warren, then Amy Klobuchar. But again, Bernie Sanders has opened a big lead. He's up to 25% in Iowa. He's up to 22% in Nebraska. A goodly lead over Buttigieg, who's in second place. And I'm going to turn to our pro-Bernie Sanders supporter. Are you confident that you're going to have a victory? And Have you been going to Iowa to help your guy?
You know, I have not been to Iowa, but I know lots of people who are there, knocking doors, sharing their stories, and he's got great surrogates there right now. Michael Moore's out there, AOC's out there, and he's really generating a lot of energy. He's got a huge ground game in place since 2016, so I think. We can never predict. It's a very fluid race, but I think Bernie's looking good. Depending on what happens with Warren's 15%, if she doesn't hit that threshold, I think she could really, her supporters could give Bernie an extra boost.
We should also mention that obviously a big story journalistically is last week the New York Times endorsed Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren, which seems to be a non-endorsement. But again, the Des Moines Register, which is one of the largest newspaper in the state, they endorsed Amy Klobuchar today. I'm sorry, they endorsed Elizabeth Warren today, and that could give her a leg up.
Right.
But she has been fading in Iowa.
Right. But she's, I think if she does rise in the poll, I could see some Bernie supporters going back. There was a lot made of that spat, but I think the progressive wing understands the strategy here that they've got to unite.
Do you agree with some of the national assessments that really that Buttigieg has an opportunity to knock off Biden in Iowa and then come back and knock him off in New Hampshire? And if he does that, he will probably be spinning out of the race, Joe Biden.
It's tough to say. I think it's such a fluid situation, and it's so hard to predict. And not being a fan of any of the Democrats, thinking that Amy Klobuchar is the only one who might be sane enough that I could ever live with, I would have to beg off that question. I think Biden is still like the establishment thing, but what I think is interesting about all of this, and we're looking at this with CNN going after Sanders on TV, and now the rumor that Obama is going to come out against Bernie.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting about this, and it goes to something Eric said over the break, I think the establishment is dying before our very eyes. Both the center establishment, the progressive Davos man, the establishment conservative, the establishment liberal. I think they're all just dying on the vine, and I think an Obama attack on Sanders would actually help him. Look at Sanders' numbers since CNN.
Yeah. I mean, I have to agree with that. And go ahead.
No, it's an interesting point that is what we were talking about over the break. I think it echoes that. Until the United Kingdom recently, the United States is the only major democracy in which the political parties have given up their right to pick their nominee. And we have gone to an actual primary and caucus process to the point where I can't remember who it was. It was a Democrat primary several decades ago where the person who won the primaries was not the nominee. They chose a different nominee within the confines of the convention. But it's not doing well, I don't think, for either of these parties or for the nation writ large that you had this kind of 16-person ridiculous conflagration in the Republican primary in 2016, and we're living through a different version of that now on the Democratic side.
The one thing that Michael Bloomberg has talked about is he does not like this monopoly of Iowa and New Hampshire. And I think, we will have another discussion of that after Iowa and New Hampshire are done. But again, those states have conspired to be in a leadership position. And again, they are not representative of the American, electorate. But again, I'm looking at a split in the first four between Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina and Nevada, not necessarily in that order. You could have a split. You could certainly also have a leader of the establishment and a leader of the Democratic Socialists, or the very liberal Democratic position. But then what happens? It seems to me that it sets it up for Michael Bloomberg, that when he comes in on Super Tuesday, Bloomberg could wipe everybody away at that particular moment. With his money and his message being, I am the Democrat who can get Republican votes that will sink Donald Trump in the fall.
$195 million.
Yeah,
No Democrat can say that.
I know he's got a lot of money. He's throwing a lot of money into this. But so far, I don't know that it's really had much of an effect on anybody.
That's in the polls.
Well,
he's jumped ahead of Buttigieg in some.
Betting odds have him third now.
Yeah.
National betting odds have him third.
Yeah.
But can you see?
Limited money does that.
Can you see the Democratic Party, the current Democratic Party? You're shaking your head, and I have to agree with you. the current Democratic Party with Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, I mean, except for Amy Klobuchar, I agree with you. She's the only one on the stage who isn't completely out
It's
of her
his running
mind.
mate. Bloomberg Klobuchar.
Bloomberg is going to. I can't see the Democratic convention nominating this guy ever. Okay, and I have to agree with one thing that you said, Eric, or a number of things you said, but we did a lot better when we picked the Democratic nominee in smoke-filled rooms. Okay, we have come up with some ringers. Okay, over the last several years, the Republican primary in 2016. I can remember sitting with some friends of mine in Sweden, listening to the first Republican debate, and just laughing that the whole thing was completely stupid. All right, and this is
Let
not
the voters speak.
okay.
That's what the
but the
founding fathers
voters,
wanted.
the
They wanted
voters. No, I don't know that the voters wanted this kind
Yeah.
of speaking to go on.
Every good democratic institution needs elements of it that are not democratic. And the elements of it that were supposed to not be democratic were the parties themselves. And that the parties would pick their nominees
have
and then the
parties.
public, well,
There
but,
was no
but as it
parties.
evolved into kind of what it was a more stable situation,
You-
the parties picked their nominees and the people picked the winner.
Mark Costello, you're a Bernie Sanders supporter.
Yes, I am.
You know that the Democratic establishment has been ganging up on Bernie Sanders since 2016.
That's right.
Your people are really pissed off about it. But my question to you is,
Yes.
if he emerges as the left-wing candidate,
All right.
there's going to be a stop Bernie movement. And
Yeah,
and
this will be
I'm
like
saying is that if you have a split decision between Biden and Buttigieg, and they can't get their act together and become a dominant challenge to him, Bloomberg is standing there, and people who support either of those, Biden or Buttigieg, probably could go to Bloomberg, and Bloomberg sails past them. And I wasn't being facetious. Picks Amy Klobuchar as a running mate. I mean, do you see the
Yeah, but
the potential viability of that?
I certainly do, and but I think that's why the energy that Bernie's really got to bring out the youth movement. There's got to be, they actually have to show up. They have to vote. But and this is what I was going to bring up earlier: is that we're approaching the 10-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, where I think laid the ground. And I remember back then, you were really Bruce was very critical of Occupy Wall Street because they didn't immediately get involved in electoral politics like the Tea Party did. But now those participants in Occupy Wall Street, they're now in their 30s. They've been living with that student loan debt. They've got spouses who are getting ill sometimes. They've got families to raise. And now you're seeing, even my most staunch anti-electoral politics friends, they're going in and they're voting. So I think if you're bringing out a different constituency, if you're bringing some energy, I just don't see the party being very excited about a Michael Bloomberg. But it would really be a test of how much money can buy our election.
There also could be a battle in the Democratic primary between socialism and capitalism, which is what we thought that the general election could be if Sanders wins the nomination with
Yes,
Trump.
but I
again, this battle could be going on for the heart and soul of the Democratic
and we've
Party.
Right,
had a-
but in the Democratic Party, I think the socialism side of this equation wins. Do you remember the Democratic Convention in 2016?
I do.
I mean, we're going to have a similar crew sitting there this time around. They are never going to. I may regret this. They're never going to go for Mike Bloomberg. I can't imagine
Money talks.
The problem with
It
Mike,
always
the
bothers
problem,
me when I have a guest on Beyond the Beltway that says something is never going to happen. 'Cause I have lots of tape of people saying that Donald Trump would never
I may
be elected.
regret that,
Yeah,
but
I think you're correct about that, and I was one of the people who said Trump is never going to be elected,
Yes,
and
you
I was
were
proven wrong. But I will say this: Hillary outspent Trump 3-1, and with a lot of dark money, and every single establishment entity behind her, and she lost. And this goes to my point, which I think that this triumphalism, and I call him progressive Davos man, of like controlled, managed, regulated capitalism, redistributing money for the super pagan, non-religious, blue state elite living in the suburbs, and they thought that was triumphant. There was the gay marriage decision, and they thought this is the kill shot. Red America, red conservatism is dead, and boy were they wrong. And I think we're seeing all over the world right now, not a ascendancy of Sanders socialism, but the actual beginnings of the rebellion against it.
Yeah, I
Right.
won't. I won't say
I
with
think
regard to Bloomberg, never, never, and never always. But the problem with, if you look at the Democratic candidates, I think if I try to put myself in a Democrat mindset, there's something about all of those people that I could find that I like about them. I think the overwhelming problem with Mike Bloomberg is there's something about Mike Bloomberg that everybody can find that they absolutely hate about the guy.
That's
And I
exactly
think that's
right.
the overwhelming sentiment on him, and that's why I don't think he has much of a shot.
Is it his religion?
No, no,
The question, we'll answer it when we come back. I'm Bruce DuMont.
The economy is not working for everybody, especially those in jobs where unscrupulous businesses keep.
Bruce DuMont back in Chicago. Thanks very much for joining us. And we have as our guest this evening, sort of representing, a libertarian and a liberal. On one side, we have Mark Casello from Calumet College of St. Joe. And also, we have Eric Cohn, who's a talk show host for WIND. He is one of our libertarians this evening and representing the other side of libertarianism. We have Bruno Barron is with us, and of course, attorney Judith Sherwin, who is a big Trump supporter. And you, not so much.
I'm not a Trump supporter. I've always been a Trump skeptic, but I'm looking at the alternatives at this point, and I don't have to vote for Donald Trump living in Illinois, but if I lived in a swing state, I'd be thinking about it.
All right. Well, we'll be discussing it each and every Sunday night between now and November, and endorsements are flying out left and right. And you want to talk about an endorsement of Joe Rogan. For those people who may not know who Joe Rogan is and sort of the powerful position he holds in media these days, give us the background.
Joe Rogan is a comedian, and he hosts probably the most popular podcast in all of America. It's hugely successful. It could get people to listen to an interview that is sometimes 3 hours or more long. He made a statement that I thought the endorsement itself was kind of interesting because he's and totally in a Joe Rogan way. If you listen to him, is like, I think I might vote for Bernie Sanders. And of course, Bernie Sanders' campaign, being a smart campaign, latched on to this and amplified it. But what's fascinating to me is two parts of it. One, I think Joe Rogan's reasoning for why he endorsed Bernie is, to me, not great. He basically said, I like Bernie because, he's believed the same thing over time. Consistency is a much overrated virtue. I think Bernie Sanders' ideas are bad, and we should have a conversation first about whether or not the views he holds consistently are good or bad ideas, and then kind of reward people for having consistency in them after that conversation. But the more interesting thing is the reaction from the left, which has been some people, of course, cheerleading that, great, this is a fantastic opportunity. Joe Rogan has a platform that reaches people we might otherwise not be able to talk to, and this is fantastic. And then the overwoke left is fit to be tied about this because, in their opinion, Joe Rogan is a bigot, largely because he platforms people, which is he has people on his podcast who has ideas he disagree with or they disagree with, and he listens to them, and he doesn't scream at them, and he doesn't shout them down. And this is something that they absolutely cannot stand. And so this kind of great awakening moment that we are living through, there's a segment of that will not tolerate Joe Rogan endorsing Bernie Sanders, which I find fascinating.
Mark's,
Yes.
where do you come down on this issue?
Yeah, so in defense of some of the woke people, if the media reports I'm reading are true, which is that in 2013 he made some comments about seeing Rise of the Planet of the Apes, and that he felt like he was descending into Africa, going into a largely African-American theater. If he said that, well, that's decidedly racist. But the key thing here is when you're building a movement across race, across class boundaries, those 6 million Joe Rogan listeners would be a welcome addition to any campaign. And how do you reach people unless you start talking with them? And how do you educate them? We can't shame people into silence in this country. And I think a large part of the progressive movement understands that you've got to have conversations and dialogue.
But a large
large
part
part
of the progressive
doesn't.
movement doesn't want to have
Shaming
those at
people
all
into
and wants to
silence.
completely
That's what we're
remove
doing.
those people from society. And that is the reaction that I think we're seeing. And this
Well-
is my, in the same way that I tend to think that the kind of Trumpism that exists now within conservatism in the Republican Party is a toxic element, I think the wokeism that exists on the left is a toxic element and can eat the left alive.
Let me ask you this question. If Bernie Sanders got elected, how much of what he promises would he be able to deliver if he has not brought along a Congress that thinks like he does?
So,
much.
I was thinking about this because, incrementalism as a response to what President Trump has done is not going to work. But I think we'll be just swinging the pendulum. If Congress doesn't come along, if you don't get that supermajority, if you don't have a grassroots movement of passionate people who can get out in the streets and put some pressure on, you're going to end up with a bunch of executive orders that can be repealed by the next president. And we'll be having a Trump Part 2 where Bernie's signing executive orders we know are going to be repealed. But I think, to disagree a little bit with Eric about the consistency point, Bernie's, motto is "It's not me, it's us," and the idea is that he's got an aspirational agenda, but it's really a movement. He's looking, it's not the the Venezuela Maduro first term. It's really more a question about, okay, if a corporation makes $100 billion, should any of that profit flow back to its workers, a little bit more of it? And
I want to look ahead and ask a political question to you, because you want Bernie Sanders in the White House.
Yes.
He's an elderly man. He's had a heart attack. People worry about his health.
Yep.
Same people may be concerned about Donald Trump's health. My question to you is, how important is the vice presidential running mate? And would you want a running mate that is going to expand his base and maybe bring in some more moderates, or do you want a dyed-in-the-wool liberal who will follow through on the policies of Bernie Sanders should the Great Reaper call?
So I'm open to a more moderate running mate, but I do think certainly it should be somebody who broadens that base a little bit as well. And so,
Is
I'm
there
open.
anyone in the field that does that?
I think in the current state of affairs, I don't see him running with a Klobuchar, but I think a Klobuchar-Bernie ticket would be interesting.
Yeah,
That could create some dialogue and
You mean a Bernie Klobuchar?
a Bernie
ticket?
Klobuchar ticket.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Judith?
I think Klobuchar is perhaps everybody's vice presidential candidate. I really do.
Yeah.
I can see her with Biden. I could see her with Bernie. I don't think
Not with Elizabeth.
Not with Warren.
not with Warren.
Yeah.
No, not with Warren. But I don't know who Warren would be with. I wanted to get back to the endorsements of Warren. I think it's
Sure,
worth,
go ahead.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning that the New York Times and what I think is one of the most bizarre comments of the last couple of years referred to her as a great storyteller.
that.
I
That's-
couldn't believe. It's like, did anybody edit
She makes
this?
things up.
Yeah, she makes things up, and then and
saying inveterate liar.
right, and then but that is they meant it as a compliment, and then the Des Moines Register said that she's going to hold the truth higher than anything else, and I'm thinking, are these people living in the same world I'm living in?
I think they are, and this goes back to my comment on the Rogan endorsement. I am still a huge Jordan Peterson fan, and that's where I first got introduced to actually listening to Joe Rogan for extended periods of time on his podcast and the stuff that he did. And I think it's interesting. There's probably no way to figure this out, but how much of Bernie's bump actually has to do with the Rogan endorsement? Because if you look at the number of views and listens he gets, whether it's 3 hours or whether it's 3 minutes of his podcasts, he probably gets more views than ABC, and maybe not ABC, NBC, and CBS, but probably more views than MSNBC, Fox, and cable, CNN, and maybe more than all of them when it comes to news. And I think this is what's happened, and this is one of the reasons why I think so much of the media, New York Times and the cable news, Fox included in that, are going so crazy, is I think that I don't know whether they feel it or whether they realize it, but I think they're losing strength by the minute. And you're getting Rogan, you're getting some of the podcasts that are out there on YouTube and elsewhere that are literally killing them, and they don't understand that they're dying yet. And I think that that's what's starting to happen.
They have been for a long time, which is how you get the New York Times endorsement of two people, where they say, it's like, well, there's this kind of like, we should, have a more moderate lane, and here's Amy Klobuchar, but if you want to get nuts, let's get nuts. Here's Elizabeth Warren for you. The idea that if you perceive yourself as having a role of trying to shape what people do as the opinion page of the New York Times, and then saying, here's one option, or here's another one, you choose. It just shows that they have no
They're
real
lost.
influence, and
No,
they're
they're
finally
lost.
understanding that they don't.
Yeah.
One other issue that may be emerging, and that is the gun rights battle that took place in Virginia this past week. But Judith, you're worried about sort of a return to the wild, wild west.
Well, I really am. I mean, I think there's a couple of forces at play here in this country. One of them we see here in Chicago. We're seeing it in New York. This idea of criminal justice reform, and the main idea is that we shouldn't have bail for criminals. We shouldn't keep people locked up when they are arrested on the streets. And so you have a situation like we had last week, which I don't know how many people even know this happened. They had a mass shooting in Seattle by two hardened criminals running around the streets with guns who shot several people, and between the two of them they had 61 arrests, and they were all out because there's no such thing as bail in Seattle. So this is terrible. I mean, so what you have then is the reaction of some normal people. I never knew anybody who had a gun. I mean, no one. I never knew a single soul who hunted or who had guns in the house. I now have a number of friends who have gone out and bought a gun, who've gone to courses where they learn how to shoot a gun, where they learn how to do concealed carry, which you can do in Illinois. And people are really starting to worry that they cannot walk around on the streets unless they have a gun. This is a catastrophe for this country, I think.
Mark?
Well,
You agree that it's happening, that there's a growth in gun awareness?
well,
and
this
gun
brings us
interest?
back to Michael Bloomberg, because it's, the color of your skin determines whether you can carry a gun
But that's
or
not
not.
true. The people at the rally in Virginia, plenty of them were black.
So, but here's the thing. Like in Chicago, I've had students who talk about the gang issues, and they'll say, I carried a gun with me because the other guys carried a gun. This is the good guy with a gun argument. But that student, if he gets picked up with that gun, he's trying to defend himself. He'll end up in jail for that firearm.
Maybe not.
Maybe not.
If
was
he
it
has a
was it
permit?
lawfully? If he has a
Not if he has a
legally.
permit.
If he has a
Okay.
permit and those
And if he behaves like an intelligent
but,
person.
So I mean, if heaven forbid he lives long enough,
We got to pause.
Okay.
I'll be back with the final segment in a moment. Bruce DuMont back in Chicago. Thanks very much for joining us. Bruno, you were going to make a comment on Judy's Wild Wild West concerns.
Well, there was that. I also wanted to comment on what Mark was saying about the gun issue, and whether you're concealed carry or whether you go to jail or whether you're allowed to carry. And I think one of the things we have to start doing in this country again, and both sides are guilty of this, and both sides have to stop doing it and start doing something better, and that is to have some trust and some even enforcement of things. Black people should not have to worry about whether they're carrying a gun or whether they're going to be taken away from having a gun. And but what you raised with the crime issue, it's amazing to me that essentially the part of the progressive movement wants to legalize crime. And people in California, you can't say or do anything that stops some criminal, and that's not criminal justice reform. That's the legalization of crime. So I just think it's time for all of us to start realizing that, there's a reason everybody wants to get armed. There's a reason everybody's afraid, and maybe I think the fear might be overblown. But we all have to start understanding each other again instead of despising each other and just immediately going to the barricades.
I think we should just add a point of context here, and I encourage everyone to read Steven Pinker's fantastic book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. We do live in a period of time that is less violent than human history has ever been. Now, there are points of it, where things like Judy has mentioned, and particularly the violence that we see here in Chicago, that are terrible problems that need to be addressed, but we should be rational about this and at least understand that this isn't even the 1970s anymore. Violence is so much less than it was back then, and we should be cognizant of that.
In our first hour, we spent a lot of time talking about the impeachment, and we spent a lot of time talking about Adam Schiff, whether he was effective or not. And there was some disagreements amongst the guests here this evening. The one thing I would like to say is that if there's someone that really screwed up last week, I thought it was Jerry Nadler. I think when Jerry Nadler sort of insulted the members of the jury, he really slept on a banana peel big time.
Right. You never insult the jury. You got to make friends with the jury, and he did not do that. And and then Adam Schiff,
Murkowski, she was open to having witnesses.
Right.
She singled him out as someone that stepped over the line.
I think Adam Schiff kind of picked up on that a little bit too, because he made this comment about people are going to have their heads on a spike. He really impugned their integrity. You can't do that. These are the the jury. They got to believe you. You don't win if the jury doesn't like you. That's number one rule of a trial lawyer. And he used to be a U.S. attorney's or assistant. He should know that.
Yep. One other thing also that a lot of people are concerned about, and that is this Chinese virus, and there's quarantine. Well, some of the largest cities in China are now being quarantined.
Right. I thought it was interesting that we're talking about all of this impeachment stuff, and how many House managers can fit through an eye of a needle or something like that. And in the meantime, we're looking at a scenario, and maybe it just turns out to be like past scenarios. It turns out to be a problem, but I think we, at our peril, we don't understand how thin the seemingly ironclad nature of our wonderful Western existence and economically rich existence might be, when literally you could have something that was greater than 1918, where huge swaths of a population can end up dying in the wrong kind of disease. And we don't know how bad this coronavirus is yet. But right before I came in here, the headline was that they've just expanded the quarantine to cover 40 million people, which is Wuhan and the two largest cities around it in China. And then the sheer number, there's 1,000 Americans. The United States government is now working to evacuate the 1,000 Americans that are inside the quarantine zone. So clearly, people are worried. Somebody's worried. And they're worried enough to quarantine whole population. So this is something that bears watching. And not to panic, but to, maybe everywhere you go, carry around your antibiotic lotion and maybe a mask.
Yep. And certainly it's a story that it could sweep past impeachment and Iowa primary and New Hampshire primaries in a hurry if it continues to grow. Does anybody want to grade how we've responded to it thus far? It seems like we're doing the right thing.
It seems like the American response is completely reasonable. I mean, you would want to get people out of China if that's the case.
Right.
But what you were saying in terms of, feeling worried enough to quarantine that many people, it is the Chinese Communist government we're talking about, and it's not as if human rights or any of those issues are really top of mind for them.
Yeah, but they
so
may be
overreaction
really
on
worried.
behalf of it could be true. It could be
really
completely
worried.
accurate. It could just be another symptom of the Chinese government being the Chinese government. And we went through similar fears with Ebola not that long ago.
Right.
And many times we've seen these kinds of fears that have not been proven out. So it's not that I don't think concern is wrong. I just urge caution on all of these things, that people tend to overreact, and we shouldn't overreact.
Clearly, I wouldn't want your listeners to be overreacting or freaking out. The interesting thing, and I'm the last person to defend China's lack of human rights on anything, but they do have a tremendously dense population in certain areas, and they have had SARS and they have had things. If you're going to get any kind of an outbreak like this, the chances of it happening in a place like China or possibly Africa for slightly different reasons, I think this is one of those situations where caution is probably the best. Overcaution is probably
Going
the
back
best
to where
result.
we began this program, the Democrats, as expected, have already announced they are now demanding that John Bolton appear before the Senate because of the bombshell nature of, at least the described bombshell nature.
Of course they are.
I thought
what's in the New York
they
Times.
are.
The sound of a spoon being banged on a high chair somewhere.
Right. Of course they are.
Another bombshell.
Well, and what I think.
Bombshell. Everything's a
So
bombshell.
tell me if I'm completely off base on this, but doesn't all of this have the sound of like a planned, like this was all
Well, this
scripted.
kind of is
we're
like
going to
when-
be able. Someone at the publishing company said, "We'll leak this." They're
Well,
timing
you,
the leaking.
You look at what happened in the Kavanaugh hearings.
That's exactly.
Every 5 or 6 days, there was another shoe that was falling. Or every 3 days,
Right, and they
I
kept
think
bringing
that's
them up.
exactly they
It's the
kept
same
bringing them
plan.
up. It'll
It's the
happen
same
again.
game plan. Same thing.
And we'll even find out whether Hunter Biden pays his paternity responsibilities in Arkansas.
You know, if Joe Biden is the nominee, that the mother of that child is going to be sitting in the audience at the debates, right?
Oh yeah, without question. As he describes Hunter Biden as his surviving son.
If she doesn't have an accident.
On that note, I want to thank Eric Cohn for being with us, representing libertarianism, at least his slice of it. Mark Casello, thanks very much. Always good to have you. Judy Sherwin, thank you very much on the right side, and also Bruno Barron, we thank you very
Thanks for
much.
having me.
Our thanks to Fritz Goldman and Andrew Marshall for their assistance in the production of this program. I'm Bruce DuMont. Good night from Chicago.